matter. So, Michael, maybe fail to do what the bill tells you to do without it having been defined. So I just wonder if you could explain, I mean, maybe you can't explain, but how and why this could possibly be the case in a piece of legislation, and, you know, what sort of ramifications that would have.
Yeah, I mean, I think drawing attention both to the substantive content of this, but also the fact that this attaches a 2-year prison sentence, I think that is really problematic in terms of both rule of law concerns and also potential human rights concerns, because of the vagueness of what this will require. So the criminal sentence attaches if you provide a false statement in relation to any material aspect of the declaration that you're about to make. And the intention to live in the acquired gender, it can only be a material aspect of the statement that is made, the statutory declaration. And you're right, the difficulty is that, and this is a difficulty that is in some ways still present within the Gender Recognition Act itself, but is mediated through both the doctor's role to show that there is a genuine case of gender dysphoria, and the panel's role of assessing the evidence that's been provided. So, but there is still an issue here, which is, what do we mean by living in the acquired gender? Do we require, for example, in order for you to demonstrate that you were living as a woman, for you to shave your legs or have long hair or wear makeup or wear dresses? And the answer is very probably under the original system, that if you don't do something like that, there may be concern. So, for example, if you had a beard, like I have quite a large beard at this point, it would be very, very difficult for you to convince a panel that you intend to live as a woman if you have a full bushy beard, or if you have no intention at all to do anything that might be classed as stereotypically feminine. Now that this has been, the third party verification has been removed, which means it's very difficult for us to think about what would it mean to live in the acquired gender separate from that medicalized process of someone who is deeply discomfortable in their sexed body, and how they might deal with that as a medical treatment. In terms of the way that this would have been operated under gender dysphoria in the past would have been in some ways to accept that this is partially a socially constructed category, in the sense that the people who are deeply discomfortable with their sex body may have to rely on sex-based or gender-based stereotypes in order to no longer feel comfortable. But now what we have is a system wherein you will be potentially sent to jail for 2 years if you lie about your intention. But there's no way for us to independently verify that intention, because it would be regressive for you to require somebody to wear makeup or dresses or have long hair. It will be incredibly regressive for you to attach any other social expectations about being a stay-at-home mother or not working in particular industries, which means the only option that's left, and it's the only option that Shona Robinson was able to provide in terms of providing evidence, is if you change your pronouns, which is to request other people to refer to you in particular ways, or you change documentation like driver's license or passport or things like that. So at that point, living in the acquired gender effectively means that you live in a legal status, and that legal status is only really manifest in things like legal documents or the social element of having particular pronouns. But even in that context, Shona Robinson said, well, none of these would be, you wouldn't be required to do all of these. Any one of them would be sufficient. So it's either the case that it would be exceptionally easy to meet this standard, because living in the acquired gender is now simply living in a legal status, and the second you get your gender recognition certificate, you live in that status. Or the requirements will be so vague and amorphous that it would be very difficult for us to then identify circumstances where where a prosecution could be brought, and particularly a prosecution that could be brought that could withstand human rights or rule of law scrutiny. Because if somebody was to be, I mean, I can't really imagine how somebody would be prosecuted for a material, potentially if they had bragged to all of their friends that they intended to lie about this, that might be some circumstance where it might be seen. But outside of that, I think it'd be almost impossible for a criminal prosecution to be brought underneath this.
And that's particularly significant because the Scottish government has repeatedly referred to this 2-year penalty as one of the safeguards for why this system wouldn't be wide open to abuse. But if on further scrutiny that totally dissolves, then it's not much of a safeguard, is it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think something that I find somewhat shocking about this is to say, you point to the fact that there are certain extremely unscrupulous people who are willing to break a whole load of laws. And you ask, how are we preventing those people from taking advantage of the system? And if the response is, well, a statutory declaration is a legal declaration, and that's really important, and most people would not go through that lightly. Well, we're talking about people who would go through that likely. And so the idea that there's a statutory declaration, if there's no mechanism to enforce that statutory declaration, if there's no mechanism to verify that it was true, then relying on the good conscience of unscrupulous criminals and rapists is not going to be the best way for you to get around the issue that there's no independent mechanism for verifying the truth or the fraudulence of these statements.
Yeah, and the Scottish Government even had an opportunity to explicitly exclude one category of people who we might be worried about, i.e. people who have an offence or on recorded offence, sexual offence, or on the sex offenders register. There was an amendment put forward to say this category of people should not be included as eligible in this legislation, and it was rejected by the Scottish Government.
Yeah, there were two actually. So one of them was this one, and initially that was introduced when it was introduced at stage 2. The provision effectively said it was a blanket ban. If you're on the sex offenders registry, you simply cannot change your legal sex. And I think it was probably quite right for the Scottish Parliament to say a blanket ban like that is probably disproportionate. You could probably run into human rights problems there. But it was then introduced again with a qualifier that said, okay, you don't have an automatic right if you're on the sex offenders registry to go through this process. You can go through a different process. You can appeal that and demonstrate to an independent panel that this is a genuine case. That seems to me to be a way to have resolved that issue, and that was voted down as well. In addition to that, though, there was also a requirement or a proposed amendment that would require there to be a pause on the ability to obtain a gender recognition certificate if you were currently in the process of going through a criminal conviction for sexual assault. And so what that would mean effectively is if you have been accused and are in the process of a criminal trial for sexual assault, you cannot change your legal sex until that has been resolved. And the reason for that would be to prevent female victims from having to refer to their rapist or their assaulter by female pronouns, to refer to them as she. And it seems to me that that would be one way to alleviate some of the concerns in relation to the dignity of these victims without having any permanent ban on the ability to change your legal sex. You could just do it after the prosecution has been resolved. And that was also voted down. So these amendments were just not introduced. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls specifically intervened in this matter before the bill got through to stage 3 and also after the bill was passed, to say that there just simply are not adequate safeguards here to prevent abuse of this system by violent males who would then put women and girls at risk.
So now I want to talk about what it would mean under this legislation to change your sex. And what the possession of a Scottish certificate would mean. And in particular, there's a bit of a legal minefield here for the Scottish Government because, and that's because of a reserved power. So under the original Devolution Act that we started with, equal opportunities is a particular policy area where the Scottish Government is not allowed to make legislation. That has to be uniform for the whole UK within the purview of the Westminster Government. And therefore, the Scottish Government has been in a bit of an ambiguous and tricky situation saying as to what exactly it would mean to change your sex under this legislation. So on the one hand, it's said that this is a minor bureaucratic matter, as you say in your report. It's just a formality, and having this certificate would not give you potentially all these extra rights or potential access to spaces under the Equality Act. On the other hand, in other situations, the Scottish Government has implied that it would do. So could you maybe talk us through what that means, why it's important, and what actually the legislation says, what's right?
Sure. So, I mean, I might start by pointing out just how serious the ambiguities are in relation to the legal effect that this bill will have. And the first one is to note that the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, at the time that that went through, it was accepted by both the Scottish government and the UK government and a number of interveners that were intervening in the case, including anti-discrimination and equality-based charities, that gender recognition is not fully devolved. It touches upon both devolved and reserved areas. And it was submitted by the equality charities that the impact that this would have on anti-discrimination legislation and equality legislation would be reserved to Westminster, and that was not challenged by any of the governments at the time. So, although the general idea of a legal sex change would be considered to be devolved, there are parts of it, there are aspects of it that have always been understood to touch upon reserved matters that are reserved to Westminster, and so that then raises some interesting questions about what the legal implications are going to be for a bill of the Scottish Parliament that proposes to change some of the provisions in the Gender Recognition Act. And part of the difficulty here is, first and foremost, there has been for a very long time ambiguity about the interaction between the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 and the Equality Act of 2010. So both of those are UK-wide, or they're acts of the UK Parliament. So these are not devolved pieces of legislation. But it really wasn't clear for a very long time whether or not a gender recognition certificate will change your sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. We weren't really sure about that. We had legal arguments on both sides for a very long time. And about 7 days before the final reading of this bill, a case was decided in the Scottish courts, which came to the conclusion that changing your legal sex and obtaining a gender recognition certificate will change your sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And the reason why they came to that conclusion is because the Scottish government argued for it. So this was a successful claim by the Scottish government in the Scottish courts that this is the legal effect of obtaining a gender recognition certificate. And the issue is that if that's true, as the Scottish government has argued, then some of the claims that have been made by Scottish ministers in Parliament, in the Scottish Parliament, just don't seem to be true. If it's true that you change sex for the purposes of the Equality Act if you obtain a gender recognition certificate, then it's simply false to say that the Equality Act will not be affected. And it's simply false to say there'll be no impact upon schools, because these will manifestly change as a result of this bill. And so the difficult question that we're asking here is, first and foremost, what will the legal effect of obtaining any gender recognition certificate have for the Equality Act? And then secondly, whether or not it'll be different between the rest of the UK and Scotland. And so the first of those questions is resolved by this case that says, if you change your legal sex for the purposes of the Gender Recognition Act, by virtue of getting a gender recognition certificate, that will change your legal sex for the purposes of the Equality Act as well. So that's been resolved. And then the second question, there's real ambiguity there as well, because at some point the Scottish government is arguing that obtaining a gender recognition certificate, the certificate that you will get by virtue of the Scottish process, will have the exact same legal effect as a UK-wide gender recognition certificate. And it's not clear at that point whether or not when they say exact same legal effect, they mean it will be automatically valid for the rest of the UK, or whether or not they will need specific provisions from the UK lawmakers to recognise them. So at one point they're saying it will be up to the UK government to decide whether they want to recognise these certificates. But at other points they're saying that they won't need the UK government's approval at all. And in fact, if the UK government tried to stop this, it would be a direct assault on the Scottish Parliament's lawmaking powers, which is frankly quite strange, considering what they're effectively saying is the Scottish Parliament should be able to change the legal system for the rest of the UK unilaterally, and it would be an assault on democracy if the UK decided, well, nobody in Wales voted for this, so maybe we should have a say over that.
Right. So what we seem to be seeing is a pretty barefaced, politically convenient description of the law. So on the one hand, where it's convenient for the Scottish government to argue in court that this gender recognition certificates do have all these implications, and that it is marching in a progressive direction for the purposes of the Equality Act and opening up all sorts of rights to new categories of people, then it will say that. But on the other hand, when it doesn't want to run into the legal minefield of going beyond its powers, i.e., suddenly doing something that affects equal opportunities, that explicitly treads on the territory of the Equality Act, then it says, oh, no, this is just a formality, which seems to be, to put it mildly, in slight bad faith.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go so far as saying that it's in bad faith, but I will say that the Scottish Government had been warned about this multiple times, both from equalities campaigners, women's rights groups, but also the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is an independent public body designed and set up to ensure the smooth running of equality law throughout the entirety of the UK. And they intervened multiple times, sending repeated letters to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government saying that there are serious cross-border implications that need to be addressed here. It's really not clear how this bill is going to interact with the operation of the Equality Act in the rest of the UK, and this needs to be resolved. And the Scottish Government seems to have responded to that, firstly by, I think, in some ways downplaying these indications. We've seen Nicola Sturgeon saying in an interview even this week that although she had been told about these, she has not heard any persuasive arguments for why there might be a change to the operation of the Equality Act. So it would be unclear to me to know what would be required in order for those arguments to be persuasive. But also, you have sky is green, and they wouldn't make the sky green. But secondly, there's nothing in this bill that's going to modify any of the provisions in the Equality Act, in the sense that it will not repeal or replace any of the provisions of the Equality Act, but it will change the way the Equality Act operates, because it's modifying the Gender Recognition Act as it applies to the Equality Act. And so although you're not changing any of the provisions in the Equality Act by modifying them, by removing them, or by replacing them, you could still nevertheless change the way the Equality Act operates by fundamentally changing the category of people who can change sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, and making it significantly easier for people to do that, and removing all third-party verification to prevent fraud.
So I'm going to move on in a minute to talk about the effect of this on single-sex spaces, but before I do, perhaps briefly you could explain the issue of that some have talked about, of gender tourism, that effectively, although this is only meant to affect Scotland, someone living in England or Wales or Northern Ireland could potentially go to Scotland to get their gender changed, and then go back into the rest of the UK and use that certificate in some way or another. So is that true? The government claims it's not.
Well, I think it depends on what the implication of getting one of these certificates is going to be, and we really don't know that at this point. That's the real issue, is that we just don't know what the legal effect of having one of these certificates is going to be for the entirety of the UK. So the bill itself states that you can get one of these certificates if you were born in Scotland, if your birth is registered in Scotland, or if you are resident in Scotland. And so the resident is the part where there might be an issue of gender tourism, because the certificate will be issued to you if you, for example, move temporarily to Scotland such that you become resident, and then can do that. The question is whether or not these certificates will change your birth. So if you are able to use one of these certificates to change your Scottish birth certificate, then it won't really matter if the gender recognition certificate is not recognised outside of Scotland, because birth certificates are recognised outside of Scotland. And so there could be practical implications here, in the sense that if you change your Scottish birth certificate in Scotland, if the UK government refuses to recognise the gender recognition certificate, but for many, many practical purposes it will recognise a birth certificate, let's say if you're applying for a single-sex school and you have to provide some documentation to prove that you're of the sex of the school, something like that, But the other concern in terms of whether or not there might be tourism here would be if getting a Scottish gender recognition certificate will be valid to change a birth certificate in that is registered in England, Wales, or Northern Ireland or something like that. So you could have circumstances where that could happen, but we really don't actually know. The UK government, in its statement of reasons for why it has blocked the bill, is of the view that it simply is not within the competency of the Scottish Parliament to create a bill that would allow for a change like that would be automatically valid in the rest of the UK. And you can see where there might be very strong reasons for accepting that. The other alternative view, which I set out in the policy exchange report, is that the the change to the Gender Recognition Act only changes the criteria within which you can get a certificate, but the certificate remains the same certificate across the entirety of the UK. And it seems like that might have been what the Scottish government thought they were doing when they said the legal effects of getting one of these will remain the same, because one of the legal effects of getting a gender recognition certificate under the UK Act is that you change your legal sex for the purposes of UK law.
Right. So on that very topic, what would be the effect of this? I mean, you've said it's slightly unclear. So this question hinges on whether the Scottish law would affect your rights and obligations under the Equality Act. And as you describe in the paper, the Equality Act doesn't actually give you the right to a single-sex space. It just means it allows you to discriminate so that you can create a single-sex space for various lists of reasons that it sets out. And so would this law, if it were passed in Scotland, would it potentially affect the ability, say, of a shelter or a prison or a charity to be able to exclude someone who had a gender recognition certificate issued in Scotland or not? So would it fundamentally affect their ability to maintain single-sex spaces on a biology basis?
So I think that the first thing to note here is that the ambiguity that exists on this point is whether or not the changes that will come in will be confined to Scotland or whether they will extend outwards. So we will know that if the bill does what it purports to do, it will change the operation of the Equality Act in Scotland at a minimum. And we're unsure at this point whether or not it would change the operation of the Equality Act in the rest of the UK. But the Equality Act is tied to a reserved matter, which means it's not open for the Scottish Parliament to interfere too strictly within the operation of the Equality Act, even in Scotland. So this is probably within the competency of the Scottish Parliament, because the test for competency gives a significant amount of latitude to the Scottish Parliament. But whether or not it's enough to trigger a Section 35 order is a separate point. So in terms of the single-sex spaces, services, things like that, I think I'll start by just setting out the position in Scotland, because that's the one that we know will change. And then you can just add on to that, this might be the case for the rest of the UK. So the Equality Act distinguishes between single-sex services, single-sex associations, and single-sex schools. So for services, these are services where there's a provision of a service to the public, either for free or for payment, but is generally open to the public and provides something in the way of a service. So this will catch most of the things that we tend to think about when we're thinking about single-sex spaces, things like changing rooms or toilets or domestic violence shelters or prisons or things like that. These are predominantly going to be classed as services. And in this context, the legal test is going to change here, because getting a gender recognition certificate will change your legal sex and will change the way the tests operate at a very technical level. But in practice, the legal test will remain broadly the same in terms of if you run one of these services, let's say a domestic violence shelter or toilets or changing rooms or things like that, the law will broadly remain the same in the sense that you will be permitted to set up these services, and you would be permitted to exclude on the basis of either sex or gender reassignment if you have an objective justification for doing that. So the actual legal rules will remain broadly the same for services. The difficulty that will arise will be in terms of the practical implication or implementation of those tests, which will mean that there might be some circumstances where, because the law is so unclear in most of these areas, that services might decide that it's just not worth the hassle of being sued for setting up one of these services in a particular that is, sex segregated in that sense. There might be a concern for services where you could indirectly discriminate by failing to provide a single-sex service. So there's currently litigation happening in Brighton with regards to a rape crisis shelter that does not provide separate services on the basis of biological sex. And the litigation is effectively saying this is indirectly discriminating against women who are victims, and also there's an argument that could be made there as well that this would indirectly discriminate on the basis of religion, because it would result in people self-excluding from these services, and so failing to provide that space on a biologically segregated or separated manner might result in there being a particular disadvantage for particular groups of women, most notably victims of assault and Muslim women as well, or those who have religious convictions that require them not to spend or to share intimate spaces with biological males. Broadly speaking, services legally are not going to change much, but practically might.
Right,
The issue really that's going to arise here.
And that's because the bar for proving that you have a legitimate reason to exclude a particular category of people might be raised, or that you could be sued more easily potentially, or because there's more people around trying to make this claim, and therefore your risk of being sued goes up.
Yeah, so there's an increased risk just because there might be more people trying to have access to these spaces. As a practical matter, that could happen. There's also an increased risk in the sense that although the legal test will broadly be the same, there will be a practical difference between, let's say, someone who's operating a changing room or a domestic violence shelter. There is a difference between excluding a biological and legal male who is covered under the gender reassignment characteristic. There'll be a test for that, and there's there's a difference between that and excluding someone who is considered to be a legal female on the basis of their gender reassignment. So from the perspective of the law, in one of these, this is a man trying to have access to a service that's designed for women, and there has to be good justification for excluding that person. But from the perspective of the law, if you've got a gender recognition certificate, then you're a woman trying to have access to these services. And so the reason for setting up a women-only service will be called into question if you're refusing access to legal women. So there could be practical implications for how those tests are implemented in regard to that, particularly if the category expands not just in numbers but also in terms of if you have people who are classed as legal women who have gender recognition certificates, who are biologically male, who do not have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and do not have any requirement to live or act in a particular way. So you could it wouldn't be completely unfeasible to imagine, for example, a very tall, bearded, biological male who has a gender recognition certificate stating that they are legally a woman, demanding access to certain female-only spaces. And so the practical could be relevant here, even if the nature of the legal test remains broadly the same.
And just to do one more category before we move on to my last question, which is schools. So schools suddenly are at play if this reform passes, because it lowers the age from 18 to 16. Is that correct? And so for that slice of the school population, people in sixth form, suddenly it potentially opens up the possibility that single-sex schools are no longer single-sex on a biological basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is true for both schools and associations. So they're dealt with differently within the Equality Act. So an association would be something like a private club or a walking group or a reading group or something like that. And schools, we know what schools are. But schools and associations are subject to different rules under the Equality Act. So for single-sex services, the rules effectively allow you to discriminate if it's justified on the basis of both sex and gender reassignment, which means whether or not you change your legal sex is going to have practical implications, but legally speaking, there's still provision there for people to be excluded. Associations, which, if you have more than 25 members and you in some way regulate the membership, and schools don't have that exception. Schools can only discriminate on the basis of sex if they are single sex schools, and the same is true for associations. They can only discriminate on the basis of the characteristic that they are set up for, which means if somebody is legally female but biologically male, their exclusion from one of these schools or associations will not be because of their legal sex. It will be because of their gender reassignment characteristic. And there's no provision in the Equality Act that permits schools or associations to discriminate on the basis of gender reassignment, which means there will now be a legal right of access to gender recognition certificate holders for associations and schools. And so for associations, that's going to cause that's already an issue that's there, in the sense that it is already the case that having a gender recognition certificate would grant somebody a right of access. But that the vast majority of associations are not going to have to deal with this because there are so few people with gender recognition certificates. But that will change under the Scottish bill. It will become much easier. And so I've seen testimonies in the news recently about people who run, for example, a women's only walking association. So they've got a large group of women who go for hikes and walks, and they do that because they just want to hang out as women. Those associations will now be subject to a heightened possibility or likelihood that they may be required under law to admit somebody who is biologically male but legally a woman into their group. And so it will be illegal for them to exclude in that context. And schools, this is where things get much more difficult for schools, because in school, the 2004 Act that set up the legal mechanism for changing your legal sex, it just was never envisaged to apply to minors. And so the school system is going to be affected much more directly here, which is that if you have a single-sex school, but even if you don't have a single-sex school, a mixed school will also have to deal with concerns here. Single-sex schools will not be allowed to exclude a gender recognition certificate holder with the legal sex that matches their sex, for the same reason that associations can't, because it would be direct discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment, and that's not permitted under the Equality Act. But there will be additional concerns for schools, even if you're dealing with mixed schools, because one of the provisions in the Gender Recognition Act, which again was not designed to apply to minors, is that if you have a gender recognition certificate, it becomes a criminal offence for somebody who has access to information that you have changed your legal sex to disclose that information if they've come across that information in an official capacity. So it's a crime for somebody to disclose that information. And so that information includes not just the fact that you have a gender recognition certificate, but also the fact of your biological sex. It becomes protected information. Now, if that applies to schools, wherein let's say an administrator in the school or a safeguarding coordinator in the school has come across the fact that some of the pupils that are registered on the school registry as male or female are actually biologically the opposite sex, it's a criminal offence for them to disclose that information to other teachers, to students, or to parents. And that would then create serious concerns for safeguarding in circumstances where, let's say, a teacher is not aware that one of their pupils, although classed as male, is legally male but is biologically female. If that teacher then takes those students on a class trip and decides who's sleeping in what room, they could end up putting a biological female into a room full of biological males, or vice versa. And that's ordinarily just not something that you would consider to be appropriate for a safeguarding perspective, even if we don't think there's going to be a massively high risk of assault or anything like that. The main issue with this is that Safeguarding 101 is built on the idea that you do not keep secrets. And this requires you, on pain of criminal sanction, to keep certain quite relevant information secret.
Okay. I'm going to ask you the last question. We've really run on a lot, so let's. No, it's okay. I mean.
And so it's possible that we lost the stream. I want to make sure that we include one of our sources. This is Glenn Greenwald. Let me refresh.
And there was an obvious recognition that these were very fundamental changes, and of course there was resistance. And instead of trying to shut down debates over that, I remember often seeking out people who had confusions or doubts or questions, because every time there was a person there who was opposed, that was an opportunity to change someone's mind and convince them to see things differently. And ultimately, that is why the gay and lesbian movement won, and it did win. By 2019 and 2020, large majorities of Americans supported the right of same-sex couples to marry, including large percentages, even majorities of young conservatives. That culture war debate was won by the advocates of treating gay men and lesbians equally. Not because they sought to shut down debate, but because they engaged it all the time. But trans activists and their allies in the media, most bizarrely, think that the debate itself is too dangerous to allow, that even acknowledging the existence of these questions and doubts is something too dangerous to do, that it puts people in danger, even though the job of reporters is to investigate claims by activists and to examine debates that our country is having. That's the job of journalists, certainly one of them. And it's what the New York Times, to its credit, has been doing, and that has prompted this angry letter. Let's just take a look at a couple of its provisions. Let me just see here. It's right on the screen. So let's pull that up. Hold on one second. I think I can. All right, let's pull up that first paragraph of that letter. It says, plenty of reporters at the Times cover trans issues fairly. Their work is eclipsed, however, by what one journalist has calculated as over 15,000 words of front page Times coverage debating the propriety of medical care for trans children published in the last 8 months alone. Think about what they're complaining about there. There is a movement to empower doctors to perform medical treatments, novel medical treatments on children. Sometimes the treatments are being performed when it comes to puberty blockers and hormonal treatments on children as young as 10 and 11 and 12 years old, surgeries as young as 15 and 16, including the removal of healthy breasts on young girls or other permanent biological and anatomical changes to young boys that can never be reversed. Of course there's going to be debate about that. There should be debate about that. There has to be questions asked.
Yes, not only that, 15,000 words over 8 months in a newspaper is not a lot if you think about it. I mean, if they were all in one article, which is probably not how they tabulated it, but if they were all in one article, an article is 2,000 or 3,000 words. So that's just 5 or 6 articles over 8 months, and then dispersed over all of the articles that appeared in the Times. That's really not a frequent occurrence of words related to that.
About the safety of these procedures, about the long-term effects of some of the drugs that are being used, not just for society in general, but for trans people in particular, and for their parents and their caregivers. Of course, that's urgent to know. whether or not these treatments are doing more harm than good, whether or not they can be safely used. And that's exactly what the New York Times has been doing. And they're complaining that the New York Times has somehow devoted too much attention to these incredibly radical changes being proposed that maybe end up being proven good and maybe end up proving bad. But of course, people are going to debate it, and the Times should debate it and examine that debate, and that's what they're doing. The article goes on.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Times has in recent years treated gender diversity with an eerily familiar mix of pseudoscience and euphemistic charged language, while publishing reporting on trans children that omits relevant information about its sources. Some of us are trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming, and we resent the fact that our work, but not our person, is good enough for the paper of record. In other words, they're trying to turn this into a labor issue, saying, you're willing to use our writing as though these are factory workers being exploited in their labor because they're trying to get published in the most influential newspaper in the country and to write about these controversial topics and are permitted to do so. They're turning this around and saying you're exploiting our labor as though we're underpaid factory workers for your own profit, your own corporate profits, even though you don't regard us as human. So they're essentially saying, you don't even respect our humanity. It goes on in that vein, quote, some of us are cis. These are the good allies to the trans people. They're cis, but they're very good allies. And we have seen those we love discover and fight for their true selves, often swimming upstream against currents of bigotry and pseudoscience fomented by the kind of coverage we hear protest. All of us dare say our stance is unremarkable, even common, and certainly not deserving of the Times' intense scrutiny. They don't want the Times' scrutiny on what, by all accounts, even if you're in favor of it, is a radical new agenda to overhaul how we think of sex and gender. The article goes on, a tiny percentage of the population is trans, although that percentage is increasing rapidly, and an even smaller percentage of those people face the type of conflict the Times is so intent on magnifying. There is no rapt reporting on the thousands of parents who simply love and support their children, or on the hardworking professionals at the New York Times enduring a workplace made hostile by bias, a period of forbearance that ends today. We await your response. So you can see their arguments there. They're simply angry about the publication of what we're about to show you are very benign articles that examine in a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand way, the debate that the country is having and will continue to have, whether or not these activists want the newspapers to note that these debates are taking place. I find it remarkable that these journalists at the New York Times are now united with activist groups and demanding the same thing of the newspaper. Of course, activists are going to pressure newspapers to publish articles that better reflect their bias. That's one of the things you do as an activist. But the fact that journalists at the New York Times are now united with them demonstrates that these journalists don't see the world differently as activists in any way. They don't want the New York Times to write articles that wouldn't be written by these activists themselves. They don't want any questioning of the activist claims. They don't want any scientific examination of these treatments. They don't want any airing of any questioning at all on this radical new debate, because according to them, that creates a hostile environment for them. I would submit that you're going to create a lot more hostility if you try and prevent people from asking these questions. You're going to do a lot more harm if you bar any discussion of scientific research into a lot of these treatments, and you're going to end up deceiving a lot of parents and a lot of trans people into believing things about these treatments that in fact are untrue or unproven scientifically. Now, let me just, first of all, let's bring Michael Tracy on, because I know he gets very agitated if he has to wait too long. This last
that there's and why I thought that they were able to assemble such an annoyingly large group of signatories who could melodramatically posture about having signed this glorious, taking this bold stance, is that it's like a bunch of just really peripheral contributors to the New York Times. I feel like you could probably have signed this letter because, like, you've debated Bill Keller in the New York Times in 2013 or something.
Yeah, no, to be clear,
period.
yeah, exactly. I think what by New York Times contributor, they mean anybody who has ever contributed any kind of content to the New York Times. So I've written a few New York Times op-eds. Over the years, I've engaged in a debate with its then executive editor, Bill Keller. I participated in many of those debates they used to have, where they would publish different people's views on various issues of controversy. So exactly, I'm as much of a New York Times contributor as the vast majority of people who have signed this letter claiming that their labor is being exploited as trans people, even though their humanity is being denied by the paper.
Right, so these people who could have signed a letter because they wrote one op-ed 12 years ago are saying that they are being harmed, or they're asserting the existence of harm that really isn't spelled out with any great detail, which I guess is probably deliberate, because that would probably result in lots of embarrassment for them if they did try to be more tangible in what they're actually claiming is the danger that's being wrought by these articles. But somebody who wrote an op-ed 12 years ago is now saying that there's like workplace oppression happening at a workplace that they're not even involved in, which I think is maybe just sort of a representation of the maybe not so
healthy,
perfect logic that's underlying the impetus for this particular letter.
Yeah, and I think there are a few New York Times staffers who actually signed on to this letter. There's a second letter as well that specifically names several of the reporters of the New York Times who they regard as the culprits. So you kind of have people who are actually more affiliated with the New York Times in a regular way, who are on staff there, signing onto a letter that criticizes publicly their own colleagues, and the New York Times seems not to have appreciated that. Let me show you, Michael, the articles that the New York Times published that has specifically provoked the anger of these joint activists, and I guess you call them like journalists if you're wanting to be generous, in this letter. So here's the first one, which I...
Yeah, let's go through this one. When students change gender identity and parents don't know. Jessica Bradshaw found out that her 15-year-old identified as a transgender at school after she glimpsed at homework assignment with an unfamiliar name scrawled at the top. When she asked about the name, the teenager acknowledged that at his request, teachers and administrators at his high school in Southern California had for 6 months been letting him use the boys' bathroom and calling him by male pronouns. Mrs. Bradshaw was confused. Didn't the school need her permission, or at least need to tell her? It did not, a counselor later explained, but the student didn't want his parents to know. District and state policies instructed the school to respect his wishes. There was never any word from anyone to let us know that on paper and in the classroom our daughter was our son, Miss Bradshaw said. The Bradshaws have been startled to find themselves at odds with the school over their right to know about and weigh in on such a major development in their child's life. A dispute that illustrates how school districts which have long been a battleground in cultural conflicts over gender and sexuality are now facing wrenching new tensions over how to accommodate transgender children. The Bradshaws accepted their teenager's new gender identity, but not without trepidation, especially after he asked for hormones and surgery to remove his breasts. Doctors had previously diagnosed him as being on the autism spectrum, as well as with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, PTSD, and anxiety. He'd struggled with loneliness during the pandemic, and to his parents seemed not to know exactly who he was yet, because he repeatedly changed his name and sexual orientation. Given those complexities, Mrs. Bradshaw said she resented the fact that the school had made her feel like a bad parent for wondering whether educators had put her teenager, a minor, on a path the school wasn't qualified to oversee. It felt like a parenting stab in the back from the school system, she said. It should have been a decision we made as a family. The student, now 16, told the New York Times that his school had provided him with the space to be himself that he otherwise lacked. He had tried to come out at his parents before, he said, but they didn't take it seriously, which is why he asked his school for support. I wish schools didn't have to hide it from parents or do it without parental permission, but it can be important, he said. Schools are just trying to do what's best to keep students safe and comfortable. When you're trans, you feel like you're in danger all the time. Even though my parents were accepting, I was still scared, and that's why the school the school didn't tell them. Although the number of young people who identify as transgender in the United States remains small, it's nearly doubled in recent years, and schools have come under pressure to address the needs of those young people amid a polarized political environment where both sides warn that one wrong step could result in irreparable harm. The public school that Mrs. Bradshaw's son attends is one of many throughout the country that allows students to socially transition, change their name, pronouns, or gender expression without parental consent. Districts have said they want parents to be involved but must follow federal and in some cases state guidance meant to protect students from discrimination and violations of their privacy. Schools have pointed to research that shows that inclusive policies benefit all students, which is why some education experts advise schools to use students' preferred names and pronouns. Educators have also said they feel bound by their own morality to affirm students' gender identities, especially in cases where students don't feel safe coming out at home. But dozens of parents whose children have socially transitioned at school told the Times they felt villainized by educators who seemed to think that they, not the parents, knew what was best for their children. They insisted that educators should not intervene without notifying parents unless there's evidence of physical abuse at home. Although some didn't want their children to transition at all, others said they were open to it but felt schools forced the process to move too quickly and that they couldn't raise concerns without being cut out completely or having their home labeled unsafe. Many advocates for LGBTQ, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, some parents said they were open to it, but felt schools forced the process to move quickly, and they couldn't raise concerns without being cut out completely or having their home labeled unsafe. Many advocates for LGBTQ youth counter that parents should stop scapegoating schools and instead ask themselves why they don't believe their children. They said ensuring that schools provide enough support for transgender students is more crucial than ever, given the rise of legislation that blocks their access to bathrooms, sports, and gender-affirming care. These disputes are unfolding as Republicans rally around parental rights, a catch-all term, for the decisions parents get to make about their children's upbringing. Conservative legal groups have filed a growing number of lawsuits against school districts accusing them of failing to involve parents in their children's education and mental health care. Critics say groups like these have long worked to delegitimize public education and eradicate the rights of transgender people. But how schools should address gender identity cuts through the liberal and conservative divide. Parents of all political persuasions have found themselves unsettled by what schools know and don't reveal. Mrs. Bradshaw said she wouldn't align herself with Republican lawmakers who sought to ban LGBTQ rights, but she also felt as though her school's policy left no room for nuance. It's almost impossible to have these discussions, Ms. Bradshaw said. There's no forum for someone like me. Other self-described liberal parents say they registered as independents or voted for Republican candidates for the first time as a result of this issue. Although they haven't sued, some have retained lawyers affiliated with the largest legal organization on the religious right to battle their children's schools. In November, Erica Anderson, a well-known clinical psychologist who's counseled hundreds of children over gender identity-related issues and is transgender herself, filed an amicus brief in a Maryland lawsuit in support of parents represented by a conservative law group. The parents have argued that their district's policy violates their own decision-making authority. Transitioning socially, Dr. Anderson wrote, is a major and potentially life-altering decision that requires parental involvement for many reasons. This is very interesting, right? So you have a clinical psychologist who's helping build a case against this idea. It's a bit nuanced, though. It's just she's advocating for parents being a part of the decision. And transitioning socially, Dr. Anderson wrote, is a major and potentially life-altering decision that requires parental involvement for many reasons. She told the Times that she had to push aside her qualms about working with conservative lawyers. I don't want to be erased as a transgender person, and I don't want anyone's prerogatives or identity to be taken away from them, she said. But on this one, I'm aligned with people who are willing to advocate for parents. The debate reflects how the interests of parents and those of their children do not always align, said Justin Driver, a Yale Law School professor who's written a book about constitutional conflict in public schools. These cases underscore how those interests can diverge in spectacular ways, even about core issues of identity. Not all children in this area have safe spaces at home. Guidelines on social transitioning vary widely among school districts. Some states, such as California, New Jersey, and Maryland, expressly advise schools not to disclose information about students' gender identity without their permission, while others offer identity or anti-discrimination guidance that's open to interpretation. The Times interviewed more than 50 people, including parents and their children, public school officials, and lawyers for both LGBTQ and conservative advocacy groups, in cases where parents ask to remain anonymous to protect their privacy or the privacy of their children. The Times made extensive efforts to corroborate their claims. One mother in California shared messages that her teenager's teacher had sent through the school's web portal encouraging the student to obtain medical care, housing, and legal advice without the parent's knowledge. A lawsuit filed against the school district in Wisconsin included a photo of teacher's flyer posted at a school that said, "If your parents aren't accepting of your identity, I'm your mom now." At schools in states such as Michigan and New York, parents said that teachers had used the student's new name in class but the old one with them so that they wouldn't be aware of the change. But other states such as Florida, Alabama, and Virginia have passed sweeping laws or issued guidance that prohibit schools from withholding information about gender identity from parents. A recent national survey conducted by the advocacy group GLSEN found that harassment and hostile school environments for LGBTQ youth directly harmed their mental health and academic performance, and that there had been a decrease in the availability of school resources for them. Some parents of transgender students said it's struggled to ensure a school will offer enough support. Jeff Walker, a father in Alabama who's aware of his teenage transition, said he learned through her mixed experiences at different schools how crucial it is for teachers to affirm transgender students, and even more so for those whose parents don't want them to transition. Not all children in this area have safe spaces at home, Mr. Walker said. Some teachers have been penalized for notifying parents that their children change names and pronouns at school. One father in Massachusetts, Stephen Foote, said he only learned that his 11-year-old had done so after the child's 6th grade teacher, Bonnie Manchester, confided in him. Mrs. Manchester was later fired in part for disclosing sensitive confidential information about a student's expressed gender identity against the wishes of the students, according to her termination letter. Mr. Foote sued the school district, accusing it of violating his parental rights. A lawyer for the district said it disagreed with Mr. Foote's version of events. Miss Manchester said she didn't regret her actions. "I shined a light on something that was in the dark," Miss Manchester said. "I was willing to lose my job. Other teachers believe they have a moral responsibility to withhold such information. My job, which is a public service, is to protect kids," said Olivia Garrison, a history teacher in Bakersfield, California, who's non-binary, who's helped students socially transition at school without their parents' knowledge. Sometimes they need protection from their own parents. One of Ms. Garrison's former students is Clementine Morales, a 19-year-old who first came out as non-binary at school because it felt impossible to do so at home. "I had to look for parental figures and other people who were not my parents," Ms. Morales said. "A hard thing to navigate." There's a network of internet support groups for skeptical parents of transgender children, some with thousands of registered members. Detractors have called the groups transphobic, because some want to ban gender-affirming care for minors, or have amplified the voices of people who call transgender advocates groomers. But members say these groups are some of the only places to ask questions and air their concerns. One Saturday morning, shortly before Christmas, a meeting of one such support group was held in Westchester County, just north of New York City. Sitting in a circle in a member's living room, 12 mothers and one father spoke of the ways they said they'd been sidelined by their children's school. One mother said her middle schooler had secretly changed names and pronouns without her knowledge, even though she'd worked as a teacher at the same school. Another mother shared how high school teachers had hidden her teenager's social transition from her until graduation because they thought she wouldn't be supportive enough. A mother of a 14-year-old who'd spent time in an inpatient therapy facility said she'd sent her school a letter from the student psychiatrist outlining concerns that the school had ignored. Most said they identified as liberal and that the living room was a rare safe space for them to voice their fears. Some parents didn't think their teenagers were really transgender. Others thought it was too soon to know for certain. Most said their children had mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder or autism. Here they could ask, what if their children had been unduly influenced by their classmates to ask for hormone treatments and surgery? What if teachers were encouraging students to see their families as unsafe, and were right-wing partisans their only sympathetic audience? It's just been such a hard thing to navigate because, the one hand, I'm dealing with my very extreme liberal values of individuality, freedom, expression, and sexuality, wanting to support all that stuff, said a tearful mother. At the same time, I'm afraid of medicalization. I'm afraid of long-term health. I'm afraid of the fact that my child might change their mind. As other parents nodded in agreement, the lone father in the room said, it's politically weird to be very liberal democratic and find yourself shoved in bed with the governor of Texas. I'm supposed to listen to Tucker Carlson? We were always available. Since 2020, at least 11 lawsuits alleging that these policies violate parental rights have been filed against school districts by parents who are represented by a conservative legal group such as the Alliance Defending Freedom, an organization with a long history of backing cases targeting the rights of gay and transgender people. 3 parents, all self-described liberals, told The Times that support groups had connected them with a legal group affiliated with the alliance called the Child and Parent Rights Campaign, which was founded in 2019 with the mission of defending children and parents against gender identity ideology, according to its nonprofit disclosure forms. Its president has spoken at conferences about the existential threat to our culture posed by the transgender movement. So far, however, the parents have sued lean Republican, such as Wendell and Maria Perez, who filed a lawsuit in Florida against their child's elementary school district with the assistance of the Child and Parental Rights Campaign. They claim that only after their child made 2 suicide attempts did the school tell them that an employee had been counseling their 12-year-old about gender confusion for months. Earlier in the year, Mrs. Perez said the school had notified them that their child had fallen behind academically, so why was this different? We were always available, he said. I don't know why they decided to hide this from us. Mr. Perez said that although he was a Catholic who objected to his child transitioning on religious grounds, he respected the rights of families who disagreed with him because he believed it was up to parents to decide on such matters. A district representative said it had investigated the matter and determined that the accusations in the lawsuit are completely false. In court filings, the district said it had never forced a 6th grader to speak with a counselor or conceal the meetings from parents. Courts have ruled that under the 14th Amendment, parents get to make medical and mental health decisions for their children, as well as direct their education and upbringing in other ways, unless they're abusive or unfit. But lawyers for schools have countered that parental rights aren't absolute. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Education has said that discriminating against students based on gender identity violates federal policy, although its guidance doesn't specifically address parental rights. The ALCU has argued that it's unconstitutional for public schools to reveal a student's gender identity to others. Angry parents put their child in private school or homeschool them, said an ACLU lawyer, John Davidson, who's co-counsel for a school district that was sued by parents in Wisconsin. Parents don't have a constitutional right to dictate to schools how they should create an optimal learning environment for students, he said. This was the same point that Todd Gosda made, or who at the time was the Massachusetts superintendent, made during a 10th school board meeting that took place before he and his district were sued by Mr. Foote, the father of the 11-year-old, who said he had learned about his child's new gender identity from a teacher who was later fired. For many of our students, school is their only safe place, Mr. Gosda said. During that meeting, and that safety evaporates when they leave the confines of our building, concerns over parental rights, he added, are in fact thinly veiled intolerance and prejudice against LGBTQ individuals. Judges have dismissed many of the lawsuits. In December, a federal judge threw out Mr. Foote's case, writing that affirming a student's gender identity was not necessarily a medical intervention or even evidence of social transition, but simply accords the person the basic level of respect expected in civil society generally. However, the judge acknowledged that it's disconcerting that school administrators might effectively or actively hide information from parents about something of importance regarding the child. In January, Mr. Foote filed an appeal. The son of Mr. Bradshaw, the mother in Southern California, said he's empathy for parents who find it hard to accept that their children are transgender, but he also expressed his frustration. When parents say they need time or patience, it can feel kind of like an excuse for them to keep misgendering you, he said. It feels like they're grieving for someone who's not dead, and it makes you feel like you're not good enough. His mother reiterated that she loves her child no matter his gender, but voiced her own frustrations. The school's telling me that I have to jump on the bandwagon and be completely supportive, Mrs. Bradshaw said. There's only so much and so far that I'm willing to go right now, and I'd hope that as a parent, that would be my decision. And so here we have Alex Salmon on gender recognition bill, which makes Sturgeon's position untenable, it says.
Untenable. You must get off this issue and onto issues where the Scottish Parliament has vast and overwhelming support.
So, Alec, you've been very critical of the Scottish Government's move to reform gender identification rights and recognition. Just tell me why.
Well, I made a speech at a Burn Supper in Dundee on Saturday night, which seems to have become a very famous speech. Somebody posted it and put it online. But yes, I'm critical of their approach to gender recognition. I think it has serious dangers for the independence movement. I don't think they've handled it very well. But above all, I'm certain this is not the issue which is appropriate for a constitutional battle with Westminster. There are many issues which should be constitutional battles with Westminster, but this isn't one of them.
Were you surprised at all to see the way the opinion polls have reacted? Support for the Scottish National Party and for Scottish independence have taken a sharp dip since this issue came to the forefront. Has that surprised you in any way?
Well, there's only really one poll which has been, that was on the weekend. There was a YouGov poll in the Sunday Times, and you can't read too much into one poll. But you wouldn't have to be a psephologist to know that the last week has probably been the most damaging publicity for the Scottish Government, and therefore by extension for independence, that there's been for many, many years. And I don't think the damage that's been done thus far is irreversible. But what I think is absolutely fundamental is to get off this subject as a constitutional battle. I mean, for example, if Nicola Sturgeon were now to take this matter to court, then that would extend this argument into the foreseeable future. And then I think the damage would become very difficult to undo. So really, what I was saying on Saturday night was, for goodness sake, get off this hill before you die on it. Incidentally, I mean, constitutional battles of Westminster are meat and drink to me. I mean, I can think of several subjects I'd be having them on this now. Europe, for example, we're getting kicked out. The single market has damaged the economy and the health service. Fuel prices, 1 million people in Scotland can't afford their fuel bills in a land of energy plenty, where electricity should be as cheap as chips. Or fundamentally, Scotland's right to self-determination. But I suppose my message is, let's stick to self-determination, not self-identification.
Look, so I mean, you say what should be done now to, in your view, mitigate or do away with the damage. But what does that come down to? Because the Scottish National Party government is not suddenly going to recant on its position here, is it?
No, but what it could do is three things. One, they could negotiate with Westminster to try and find, or indeed with the 9 SNP rebels who put forward sensible amendments to the legislation in the Scots Parliament, all which were just kind of swept aside. So they could negotiate to try and take some of the sting and the heat out of the issue. Secondly, we have a process which I introduced in Scotland called citizens' assemblies, where you take difficult, controversial, conscious issues and you give them to discussion over a prolonged period to a group of citizens who come up with recommendations. And we devised that process precisely for issues such as this. I mean, I'm the first minister who introduced equal marriage in Scotland. which at that time was controversial, much less so now. But in the process of the introduction, we didn't have a citizens' assembly, but we were willing to take on board people's concerns and other points of view. But above all, when you're in a hole, as the SNP are at the present moment, you should stop digging and therefore abandon all thought of having a court battle over this, because all it will do is prolong the publicity. And the difficulty, I think, the publicity is exemplified by Nicola Sturgeon's own performance. I mean, Nicola is one of the most gifted communicators in politics. But on this issue, in trying to defend self-identification, she's been reduced to stumbling incoherence. And a nationalist leader in Scotland, can have many things said about them by Westminster, but when you get to the stage that people are starting to laugh at you, then that is the stage at which you should realise you're trying to defend the indefensible. I mean, what's indefensible is not a change in people's gender. I mean, not even to make gender recognition easier and perhaps more humane than it is at the present moment. What is indefensible is self-identification. That is the idea that you can change your sex legally by just opting to do it in a 3-month period. And given the judgment in the Scottish courts in December, where Lady Haldane said that means you could change your sex for all legal purposes, if you are past that, then it makes it impossible to defend hard-won rights like single-sex spaces for women, things that the feminist movement have strove and fought for and were enshrined in the Equalities Act. You come up against an inevitable conflict where ideology dissolves into dust when it's faced with reality.
Okay, you're speaking very bluntly on this. I mean, you've deemed the policy, the Scottish government's move on gender identification, to be a blunder politically and in principle. You've described the handling by Nicola Sturgeon as simply wrong and described her defence of it as stumbling incoherence. In your view, is Nicola Sturgeon's leadership of the government, leadership of Scotland, still tenable?
At this stage, yes, but it would.
At this stage,
well, if you continue to conduct the argument about Scottish self-determination and Scottish independence, having this issue as the touch point and the conflict between Westminster, then it would be untenable. You must get off this issue and onto issues where the Scottish Parliament has vast and overwhelming support, like the pure poverty in our land of energy plenty, like the European issue, and like Scotland's essential right to self-determination. These are the issues where you should be battling with Westminster, where Scotland by majority is right behind you, not in an issue where Scottish support is A, divided, and B, that division of opinion is against you rather than for you.
Okay, so again, Alec, you are being characteristically blunt. I mean, you tell me that Nicola Sturgeon's leadership of Scotland and of the SNP is not tenable if she sticks to this position, and she's sticking to this position. Is that argument on your side in any way undermined, as some might believe, by the bad blood between you and Nicola Sturgeon? She spoke out, as we all know, about your personal conduct. You were cleared in a court of accusations of sexual misconduct, but bad blood there must be. Does that in any way undermine your position?
No,
And just to be clear, this is about 8 days ago, so this is a week before Nicola Sturgeon stepped down, so this is kind of a foreshadowing.
I suppose if I were pursuing this as some sort of personal argument, I would just keep my mouth shut and not give any advice to do anything and just let the SNP government continue to dig a hole for itself. But to me, the cause of independence has always been the most important thing. I spent all my lifetime striving for Scottish independence, as have others as well. And it's heartbreaking to see support for independence, so painstakingly built up over a 30-year period, dissipated on this argument, where frankly the Scottish Parliament have passed wrong-headed legislation. They've done it without considerable thought and without making concessions on a difficult, touchy issue which would reconcile it with Scottish society. I mean, over the years, John, the independence movement has built from, let's say, 20% support to over 50% support. And we had various groups in Scottish society, go back to the 1990s, who were frightened about independence. I mean, at one stage, the Catholic community in Scotland wondered if independence would produce some sort of Northern Ireland. And over the years, that these concerns were addressed, and by majority, the Catholic community voted for independence. The Asian community had to be satisfied that they would find an equal role and a valued role in Scottish society. And again, by vast majority, Asian Scots voted for independence in 2014. The business community had to be persuaded that the SNP weren't sort of unpragmatic romantics with no head for business. And over the years, we gathered substantial business support for the SNP. So you cannot have a situation where any group in society feels themselves threatened by independence. And the difficulty with this argument of self-identification is that feminist activists, a substantial part of the women's movement in Scotland, believe that self-identification is a threat to their hard-won rights on single-sex spaces. Now, you cannot have that group, that vital group in society, looking to Westminster for protection as opposed towards their own parliament. So my interest in this, and this incidentally is the first speech I've made on the issue, John. It's not as if I'm harping on about it on a daily basis. My interest in this is wholly to get the cause of independence back onto the right track and start focusing on the issues where we'll gather more support as opposed to lose support. Now, I don't think it's too late to do that. I don't think one opinion poll, it can't be reversed. But
you do fear this issue. You do fear, Alec, this issue may have wrecked the case for independence and the prospects of independent Scotland.
Exactly the opposite. I'm saying let's get off this onto higher, better ground for the independence movement before it does us serious damage that's more difficult to reverse. So one opinion poll doesn't make a settlement. On the contrary, the opinion poll should be a warning sign that unless we stop the sort of damaging controversy, publicity and divisive issue of the last few weeks, then that's what would happen. But it doesn't have to happen. The future's for us to make. And the frustrating thing is there's so many amazing issues to campaign for independence on right now. As the million people shivering in their homes in Scotland would tell you, in our land of abundance of energy. So let's get onto these issues, onto that high ground, and let's take this difficult issue of equality and personal rights and identification and have that debated and discussed in a way that draws the political and the constitutional sting out of it. So,
okay, last question, if I might, to you, and I know you will dismiss this contention, but I want to put it to you anyway. I mean, in the very recent past, an argument revolved around you, which became pretty prominent, about your role as a presenter for Russia Today.
And Spain passes law allowing people to freely change gender from age 16. This is very similar to the Scottish law that was struck down not by Scotland but by the UK, or by the entire UK. After months of sometimes heated debate within the ruling left wing, Spanish MPs on Thursday gave final approval to a law allowing people to freely change their gender from the age of 16, at a time when other European countries are holding back on this controversial subject. The so-called transgender law, which is the battle horse of the radical left-wing Podemos, an ally of the socialists in Pedro Sanchez's government, allows people to change their gender on their identity papers by means of simple administrative declaration from the age of 16. Up to now, transgender people needed a medical diagnosis by several doctors of gender dysphoria, which is a psychological condition of feeling mismatched with one's biological sex and gender identity. They also had to prove that they had undergone hormone treatment for at least 2 years. And here we have Anas Sarwar, who is Scottish Labour leader. He discusses the gender reform bill and the devolved powers in opinion polls. This is on Daily Record.
A vital role. I'm sure everyone would agree.
I'm told I'm the best columnist at the Record, Paul.
We've got many columnists and they're all equally valued. Now, obviously, the Scottish Labour Party has got its annual conference beginning in Edinburgh on Friday, and I thought that now would be a good time to interview Anas. We're going to split it into two different segments. One is a Q&A with me, and then at the end we've got some readers' questions that we'll be posing to Anas, and I'm sure he'll enjoy that. So, Anas, thanks for joining us. It's appreciated.
My pleasure.
Should we kick off?
My pleasure. A great pleasure. Yeah, crack on.
Right. I want to come to the conference, but shortly. But I want to start off by focusing on what has probably been the main issue, or one of the dominant issues in Scottish politics over the last 6 weeks or so, and that is gender recognition reform. Now, if we go back to before Christmas, the legislation passed overwhelmingly, and it passed with Labour support as well. Now, given everything that's happened since then, and by that I mean Alistair Jack has effectively blocked the law from coming into force, do you regret Labour support for this legislation?
No, I think it's important to stress that we have taken a good faith approach from start to finish. We were very honest at stage one of that process that we didn't think the legislation was anywhere near good enough, so we supported it based on its principles. We then went into stage two of the process, wanting further safeguards, wanting the Equality Act written into the actual legislation, that no part of the legislation would undermine the Equality Act in any way. And it's true to we got that passed at stage two, and we got to stage three, and it's true to say we wanted further amendments passed at stage three, amendments around sex offenders not being able to access a GRC, people not being able to change their gender during, for example, a rape trial. We wanted further amendments around protection of single-sex spaces, around biological sex. And on many of these instances, the government didn't accept the amendments, but accepted the premise of the argument and suggested that many of those issues would be resolved when it came to the guidance. And that's guidance either from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who have the statutory duty to provide the guidance, or indeed Scottish Government guidance about what it meant, for example, prison services, what it meant for health services, what it meant in terms of access to single-sex spaces. So I think we were right to support the principle of removing the inhumanities of obtaining a GRC, but I think the government was wrong ultimately in terms of rejecting those amendments around sex offenders and around protection of single-sex spaces. And I think that mistake is now pretty clear for people to see. I think it's also important to stress that the controversy we've seen in recent weeks haven't actually directly related to the bill itself, because the bill has not been enacted, but I think does demonstrate some of the inconsistencies that the government has allowed to persist here. And I think the big tragedy in all of this
inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Is I think everyone has lost out. I think you have seen over the last month, women have lost out in terms of feeling pressure around their own identity and not feeling there's adequate protections around single-sex spaces. I think our trans communities have lost out because I don't think anyone in our trans community would feel pretty protected right now in terms of the tone of the debate. And I think this is an entirely unfortunate situation. So I think we're right to support the reform of how to obtain a GRC, but I still think there is work to do around protecting single-sex spaces based on biological sex and having appropriate guidance across our public sector.
So let's imagine that Ian Murray and not Alistair Jack was currently Scottish Secretary. Would you be calling for him to revoke this Section 35 order?
So what Ian Murray said at the time was he believed it was the wrong approach. The wrong approach was to do a Section 35. The right approach would have been to instruct the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, whose statutory duty it is to perform this role, to issue guidance following the passing of the GRR bill. Both governments should have made a commitment that any inconsistencies that were identified by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, both government make a commitment that they would address those inconsistencies, and then both governments should issue their own guidance. One guidance in terms of how it interacts with the Equality Act, so people have confidence when they're making day-to-day decisions about access to single-sex spaces, but also for the Scottish Government to have appropriate guidance, which they're now committing to do around, for example, the Scottish Prison Service. I think that would have been the good faith approach. Instead, as is so often the case in Scottish politics, it's become, for one side, a constitutional issue, and another side, a culture war issue. And who loses out? We all lose out in that frame. When in actual fact, I think there is a way forward here, if people are willing to act in good faith, that protects against all forms of prejudice, whether that be transphobia or misogyny and sexism, but also helps to remove inconsistencies, remove inhumanities about obtaining a GRC, whilst also protecting single-sex spaces based on biological sex when it's appropriate to do so.
issue that's come up over the last few weeks on the back of the bill passing. As you say, they are separate. That's the troubling case of Isla Bryson, the rapist who ended up in Cornwall prison temporarily. Now, Nicola Sturgeon's been asked a very specific question about this, so I'm going to put it to you as well. Do you believe Isla Bryson is a woman?
Isla Bryson committed rape. Rape is committed by a man in Scots law, and therefore should be treated as such. So a rapist, a man, should not be allowed into a women's prison. I think that is pretty clear. And to be honest with you, I think any well-meaning and sensible majority, whichever side of the debate they fall on in terms of protecting trans rights or indeed protecting and entrenching further women's rights, would both accept, I would hope, that anybody that's convicted of rape committed as a man, will be nowhere near a women's prison.
So just to be clear, are you saying that because this person is a rapist, that makes this person a man?
Well, I don't, to be honest with you, I don't really care how Isla Bryson chooses to identify themselves right now. The fact is that they committed rape, they were found guilty of rape, rape is committed by a man, and they should be treated in such a way when it comes to our criminal justice system and where they should be housed when they're in our prisons.
From The Gleaner, we have Spain approves menstrual leave, teen abortion, and trans laws. Spain's Equality Minister Irene Montero looks down during a press conference after an emergency meeting for worrying surge of gender violence in Madrid, Spain on January 27, 2023. The Spanish Parliament on Thursday approved legislation expanding abortion and transgender rights for teenagers, while making Spain the first country in Europe that'll entitle workers to paid menstrual leave. The driving force behind the two laws was Equality Minister Irene Montero, who belongs to the junior members in Spain's left-wing coalition government, the United We Can Party. The changes to sexual and reproductive rights means that 16 and 17-year-olds in Spain can now undergo an abortion without parental consent. Period products will now be offered free in schools and prisons, while state-run health centers will do the same with hormonal contraceptives and the morning-after pill. The menstrual leave measure allows workers suffering debilitating period pain to take paid time off. In addition, the changes enshrine in law the right to have an abortion in a state hospital. Currently, more than 80% of termination procedures in Spain are carried out in private clinics due to a high number of doctors in the public system who refuse to perform them, with many citing religious reasons. Doctors in the public system refuse to perform them, with many citing religious reasons. And here we have the majority show, and there's a small section on the gender bill here.
Wider numbers of people in. It's not just about necessarily being against a particular bill or so on, but just against the general malaise that Nicola Sturgeon has brought to Scotland.
Yeah.
Of course, it's now clear that the bill is about fomenting a grievance with the UK, because Sturgeon had three possible options. The first one, when it was blocked, the first one was to drop the bill entirely. That's a bit unlikely. The second one was to amend the bill, take the bill back, say, okay, it does impact UK equalities law, we'll amend it, and we'll also take more consideration of women's issues, women's concerns, and we'll still get something through for trans people as well. And the third option was to fight it in the courts. Now, of course, if she fights it in...
Again, and I'm not sure if you can see his shirt, it says "Resign Sturgeon" on it. This was 4 weeks ago, so again, this is a bit like a premonition.
The courts, then she loses, then they lose the bill entirely. So trans people don't get any benefit from that at all. Of course, which of those three options do you think she chose, David?
Oh, needless to say, the First Minister plumped for option C, another meaningless and wholly unnecessary legal battle with the UK government. And as MP Lee Anderson put in the House of Commons, I think yesterday, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill is a cynical attempt by the SNP to use young people on their pathetic pathway to independence. couldn't have put it better myself. We all see you, Mr. Sturgeon. We know exactly what you're playing at. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think. I mean, it seems like the way their playbook has been recently, without any real ideas, is that they'll create laws that exceed the powers that they're given to the Scottish devolved administration. And then when the UK blocks it, they'll go, Westminster bad.
Yeah.
And the democracy, we're the upholders of democracy, a most ridiculous concept, when they've denied the results of 2 referendums and continue on this ridiculous democracy denying thing with like the de facto referendum, and even like ALBA people are like UDI. It's like, these are not defenders of democracy in any way.
No.
And meanwhile, they just do not do anything with the day job at all.
Yes.
Right, and they just keep rinsing and repeating this idea. We'll distract everyone with this, referendum bill first of all. Then we'll distract everyone with this gender bill, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And it's so tiresome.
Yeah. It's true. I love this idea that anybody who's speaking out against this bill is anti-trans. No, it's like saying if you criticise the SNP for not building ferries, you're anti-sailor. It's just ridiculous. It just happens to be the subject matter,
Okay.
The objection of the UK government is on the operation of this law within the context of the UK Equalities Act. And the UK government warned them several times, and they didn't engage at all. This is just chickens coming home to roost. This is what happens if you pass bad laws and ignore the reserved issues upon which they impact. So completely predictable, completely avoidable, and all done deliberately to stoke grievance, nothing else.
Well, yes, and thanks for that comment, Rita. But the question I have is that why is this allowed to happen in the first place? Why is Scotland allowed to make gender laws that are different from the rest of the UK? And I mean, now you can even widen this out. Why are we do we have different taxes and so on? These are just recipe for disaster. And I think perhaps Labour and certain Conservatives, Adam Tompkins, for example, and some of the other ones, they're like, just give them more powers and they'll comply. But what they do is they use these powers to divide even more. Now it almost seems it's deliberate. They pick a wedge issue and they try and get people, and they try to put it up to the Westminster government. When the Westminster government says no, as it rightly should, because it's got the primary government, then they go, Westminster bad and so on. It's
well, we've got Mr. Tommy Boy is saying, I see it as like the Lord sending a bill back to the House of Commons, which must happen fairly regularly. It's time Holyrood was held to account. That's the problem, isn't it, that we don't have a second house?
Well, I think someone mentioned this the other day, and I said, well, the UK government should actually be the second house. We don't need more. The last thing we need is more politicians. We're already over-governed as it is. I put out this tweet the other day. It's got over 2,000 likes. It says, the majority of Scots don't want different laws and taxes from the rest of the UK. We just want the potholes fixed and the bins emptied. We don't want different gender laws. We don't want these different tax bans, different all this different stuff. We're supposed to be in one country, and it causes so much problems and allows these people to create more and more grievance over stuff as well. It's really shocking here. I mean, I wonder.
Watch this space. We'll be back in just a moment. And remember, your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Corbyn has been banned by Starmer to run for position with Labour. And here's Starmer on the issue.
Thank you, Marie. Today is an important moment in the history of the Labour Party. It's taken many, many months of hard work and humility to get here. It's meant rebuilding trust, not just with the Jewish community, but with all those who were rightly appalled by the culture of the party under the previous leadership. When I became leader, I said I would turn Labour around and give it back to the British people. And the most important and urgent part of that was in tearing out anti-Semitism by its roots. Anti-Semitism is an evil, and no political party that cultivates it deserves to hold power. I said from the start that we would be judged not on our own terms, but by the return of those who felt they could no longer support us. The first step on that journey was to accept the findings of the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
I think the major impetus here is the tense of this speech, because all of these social ills, according to Keir Starmer, are now gone. They're done, so we don't have to even deal with them anymore, right? This is the implication of this speech. Oh, that's all finished. There is no more of that.
But there was no space for anyone who didn't do the same. That is as true today as it was then. Let me be very clear. Those who seek to blame others or downplay what happened in our party are themselves part of the problem, and we will have zero patience or tolerance of that. Having accepted the Commission's report, the onus was then on us to begin to right the wrongs of the past. I'm proud to lead a party and a team that have worked tirelessly to do so, and it is as a result of that work that I'm speaking here today. But while it is an important moment, it is not one for celebration. It is one for reflection on how a party that has always prided itself on anti-racism, on its commitment to equality, its belief in a better, fairer Britain, could have fallen so far as to betray its own principles as well as the principles of the country. This is also a moment to apologise once again to all those who were hurt, to all those who were let down, to all those driven out of our party who no longer felt it was their home, who suffered the most appalling abuse. Today, on behalf of the entire Labour Party, I say sorry. What you've been through can never be undone. Apologies alone cannot make it right. But just as I promised to take this issue head on, today I make you a number of further promises. Firstly, that under my leadership there will be zero tolerance of anti-Semitism, of racism, of discrimination of any kind. And secondly, that every day I will work ceaselessly to bring this party back to the British people. Be in no doubt, the job of restoring Labour is not complete, not even close. I don't see today's announcement as the end of the road. I see it as a signpost that we're heading in the right direction. I feel humbled when I think of all those who've tirelessly dedicated themselves to getting Labour back on track, all those inside and outside the party who've made it their mission to restore, renew and rebuild Labour on behalf of the country. It's thanks to them that we can say firmly, proudly, confidently, the Labour Party has changed. Not because it was convenient to do so, not by fiddling around the edges, not just until the next person to lead the party comes along, but permanently, fundamentally, irrevocably. We have changed from a party that looked inward to a party that meets the public gaze, from a party of dogma to a party of patriotism, from a party of protest to a party of public service. Change is never easy. And I understand that some people won't like the changes that we've made. But I say this with all candour. The Labour Party is unrecognisable from 2019, and it will never go back. It will never again be a party captured by narrow interests. It will never again lose sight of its purpose or its morals. And it will never again be brought to its knees by racism or bigotry. If you don't like that, if you don't like the changes that we've made, I say the door is open and you can leave. But to all those who can see we've changed for the better and are excited about doing even more, to all those who dream of a Britain that is fairer, greener, more dynamic, to all those who want to make this great country greater still, I say, the door is open, come in, make us your home again. Working together, I believe we can do great things for our country. I believe we can be a force for good, and that starts today. No one knows better than me that there is much still to do. That is why my third promise to you today is that I will not rest for a moment until the job of changing the Labour Party for the better, and then the job of changing our country for the better, are complete. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to take some questions now from the media, and I think, Alex from BBC, we're starting with you.
Thank you very much, Sir Keir. Alex Forsyth, BBC News. You've talked today about how the Labour Party on your watch has changed. Can you say categorically whether or not the former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, will stand for Labour at the next election?
Let me be very clear about that. Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate. What I said about the party changing, I meant, and we are not going back, and that is why Jeremy Corbyn will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election. Thank you, Alex. I think, Marie, we're coming to you, Sky News.
Hi, Keir Starmer, Marie Aurora from Sky News. You served under Jeremy Corbyn in his shadow cabinet, and today we've had the campaign against anti-Semitism come out and say that they still don't think they've had enough investigative, essentially disciplinary investigations into anti-Semitism against more than 12 MPs. Don't you think this undermines your commitment to Jewish people and Jewish voters, that you're taking this seriously?
Well, thank you for that.
They're not going to stop, is the thing, you know. The history is that Starmer did the things that he says he wants to eradicate from the party. So technically, he should eradicate himself.
My actions over the last 2 to 3 years have made it absolutely clear that my commitment is to tear anti-Semitism out of this party by the roots. That was the first thing I said as leader of the Labour Party. That's why we've taken the action that we've done. That's why I am pleased today that the Commission has said that they're confident in the plan that we have put forward. But look, as I said a moment ago, this is not the end of the road. This is just a signpost, and we must be as robust as we go forward as we've been until now. And whatever cases and allegations are put to us, we will take the same robust approach. Today is an important day, but it's certainly not the end of the road in relation to that. Thank you. Harry, ITV.
Good morning. Harry Horton from ITV News. You served under Jeremy Corbyn in his shadow cabinet. When you were serving under Jeremy Corbyn, could you not see anti-Semitism spreading throughout the party? And if you could, why didn't you do more to speak out about it?
Well, Harry, thank you for that question. As you know, it's a matter of record that on anti-Semitism I challenged the previous leader both in the shadow cabinet and publicly on that. And it's absolutely clear that the Labour Party lost its way, and that's why I knew that my first duty as leader of the Labour Party was to change the Labour Party and to tear anti-Semitism out. That's why, on my acceptance speech, I made an apology on behalf of the Labour Party and made that my commitment. And what I asked of all those that were affected was the opportunity to be given the space to do what I needed to do and to be judged by my actions. And I'm grateful to all of those who gave me that space and are now judging me on my actions. Thank you, Harry. Lee.
Lee Harkin from Jewish News.
Yeah.
Are you today promising you will take action against any MP, any councillor, any member in the party who denies anti-Semitism, who uses the phrase purge of socialism to excuse anti-Semitism? Are you pledging action against these people?
Lee, thank you very much for that question. I hope I've made it clear this morning and previously that
the phrase purge of socialism to excuse anti-Semitism. Are you pledging action against these people?
Lee, thank you very much for that question. I hope I've made it clear this morning and previously that all those that deny there is a problem, there was a problem of anti-Semitism. All those that pretend it was exaggerated are part of the problem themselves and will be dealt with under the rules of the Labour Party, because it's very important that we are robust in relation to those views that this was all somehow exaggerated and the extent has been disproportionately blown out. I don't accept that, and I don't accept that has a place in our Labour Party. Thank you, Lee. And Ben from the Jewish Chronicle, please.
Good morning, Sakir. Hi. So it seems this is a really big day for the Labour Party. It seems the upper echelons are in the right place and the HRC is happy with the progress. But as alluded to by Marie van der Zyl at the Board of Deputies, there are still issues at the local level with councillors and party officials. JC revealed just yesterday a party official local party official, who had been posting, extremely questionable content for many, many years up until most recently. So, are you confident that issues are being addressed at the local level, and how can you reassure Jewish people who want to get involved in local party politics that they will be safe to do so? Thank you.
Well, Ben, thank you for that question. The fight against anti-Semitism is never over. And that's why it's so important that I make it clear today that, of course, it's an important day for the Labour Party that the Commissioners decided that our plan has been operated and they're content with it. But it doesn't mean the fight against anti-Semitism is over anywhere in any political party, including my political party, and we will continue with the same robust approach, because the changes that we've put in place are fundamental, they're substantial. The Labour Party has changed. And the Commission would not have signed off today if they didn't think it was fundamental and substantial. And so wherever there is anti-Semitism, we will chase it down and we will deal with it in the same robust way as we've done over the last 2 to 3 years. Thank you. And I think we've just about got time for Theo from LBC.
Theo Ashwood, LBC. Thanks for taking my questions, Sakir. At the beginning of your statement, you said that under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour cultivated anti-Semitism. That would suggest that there may have been a political intention to allow a culture of anti-Semitism to foster perhaps political ends. Do you think that's the case? And I think everybody in this room could testify to the fact that there is still anti-Semitism is still prevalent in society. And how much responsibility do you think Jeremy Corbyn, his leadership of the Labour Party, bears responsibility for that? Thank you.
Well, Theo, thank you for that question. I think that the work against anti-Semitism is never over. It was absolutely clear to me when I took over as leader of the Labour Party that we had to change the Labour Party and we had to start with anti-Semitism. And that's why, as leader of the Labour Party, in my acceptance speech, I apologise for what had gone before, and that's why I said what I said this morning, and I stand by those words. But look, very, very important that we're clear that this is a signpost that we are making progress, a signpost that the actions we've taken over the last 2 to 3 years are the right actions. But it would be a complete mistake, in my view, to think that now somehow the job is done. It is never done. We must fight anti-Semitism wherever we find it, every day as a political party, every day as individuals. Thank you, Theo. And Alitha from The Guardian.
Thank you, Sakir. Alita Addy from The Guardian. If you are set on ensuring that the Labour Party will be one not of protest but of equality, will you this morning prescribe the Momentum Group that has long supported Jeremy Corbyn, or at least put them on notice this morning?
Well, look, I have many powers and duties and responsibilities in the Labour Party, but that one is not for me, I'm afraid. But look, whatever group or individual in the Labour Party, I think the message from this morning couldn't be clearer. This is an important day.
Okay, Labour Party plunged into chaos as Corbyn's cronies ready to challenge Starmer's decision. This is from yesterday. Jeremy Corbyn and his allies are expected to challenge Sir Keir Starmer's vow to block him from standing as Labour candidate. Jeremy Corbyn and his allies have come out fighting after Sir Keir Starmer barred the former Labour leader from standing for the party in the future. Mr. Corbyn's expected to challenge Sir Keir's vow to block him from standing as Labour candidate, claiming the move's a flagrant attack on democracy. Giving a press conference yesterday in which he addressed the party's history of anti-Semitism, Sir Keir said the former Labour leader betrayed the values of the British people. He blocked Mr. Corbyn, who is currently suspended from the party, from making a return, saying, "Will categorically not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election." Allies of Mr. Corbyn have said he's likely to seek the Labour nomination for his constituency from the local party. He's been the MP for Islington North for 40 years. The move could force Sir Keir to formally block his candidacy, with sources suggesting Mr. Corbyn may fail the vetting process because of his past remarks on anti-Semitism. Mr. Corbyn would be left with the option of running as an independent candidate in the seat where he retains deep-rooted local popularity. In a statement posted to Facebook yesterday, Mr. Corbyn said Keir Starmer's statement about my future is a flagrant attack on the democratic rights of Islington North Labour Party members. Mr. Corbyn, who led Labour to 2 successive electoral defeats, said in a statement, "It's up to them, not party leaders, to decide who their candidates should be. Any attempt to block my candidacy is a denial of due process and should be opposed by anybody who believes in the value of democracy." Diane Abbott, who was Mr. Corbyn's shadow Home Secretary, also weighed in, saying, "The day Starmer won leadership of the Labour Party, he described Jeremy Corbyn as a friend and a colleague. Now he wants to throw him out of the party." Writing on Twitter, she also hit out at fellow Labour MP Dame Margaret Hodge, rejecting her suggestion that Sir Keir was fighting privately to address the issues under Mr. Corbyn's leadership. Mr. Abbott said, "I was in Jeremy's shadow cabinet alongside Starmer. It is nonsense to say he was fighting privately." The Equality and Human Rights Commission yesterday announced that it's concluded its monitoring of the Labour Party over anti-Semitism within the party. Mr. Corbyn was suspended from the parliamentary party over his response to EHRC's damning report in 2020 and now sits as an independent MP. And here we have Diane Abbott on Corbyn.
Hi guys, so on Wednesday the Labour leader Keir Starmer sent out a very strong message to the left-wing support base within his
and this is Maximilian Robespierre's
party.
Page.
"Unite behind me or there's the door." Sir Keir was also asked about the fate of the former leader Jeremy Corbyn, and Starmer was adamant he will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election. Now, Diane Abbott, a strong supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, was interviewed by the newsagent's podcast, where she dropped something of a bombshell regarding her former leader. Have a listen to this.
What do you remember, Diane, of Keir's relationship with Jeremy when he was in the shadow cabinet? I do recall Keir Starmer calling him a colleague and a friend in the leadership election. What was your recollection of that time?
Well, they had a perfectly good relationship as far as I knew, a perfectly friendly relationship. The only thing that they differed on was that Jeremy, in his heart of hearts, is a Brexiter, and Keir Starmer at that point was passionately pro-European.
You think he was in his heart of hearts a Brexiter?
Yeah, sure. I've known Jeremy a long time. Remember when in the 80s, when both of us were sort of starting out in the party, Tony Benn, who was a huge hero to all of us and a hero to the Labour Party grassroots, he was anti the EU. He saw it as a conspiracy of business people and so on. So that was a common view on the left in the 80s, and I think it's a view that Jeremy still held. But Jeremy's always been about uniting the party, and he knew most party members were pro-European. But himself, I would say, deep down, he was a Brexiter.
Do you think he voted Remain then, Diane? Or leave?
Oh, he would have voted Remain, because that was the policy of the party.
Yeah. But Diane, why wouldn't you be honest with your party if you were the leader and that was where you stood?
No, Jeremy, after all his years in the party, at the end of the day, is loyal to the party.
Wow. Okay. That was a bit of a bombshell, because I had she would not answer the question, or she wouldn't actually talk about the difference when it comes to the European perspective. Look, I think it's not a shock to many people that Jeremy Corbyn was a Eurosceptic back in the 1980s. And we don't know how he voted, because I don't believe he's ever said how he voted in 2016. But I find it strange how somebody would be a Eurosceptic and then vote Remain in 2016, and then be referred to now as a Brexiter or Brexiteer, because Diane Abbott said, in her own words, he is a Brexiteer. Not he was, but he is. Which calls into doubt the fact that he voted Remain. Now she says, well, he voted Remain because that was the party line. But that was a referendum. It was not, you must vote this way because the party tells you. There was no 3-line whip or anything like that. There was no obligation on members of the party to vote a particular way in the Brexit referendum. It was not a parliamentary vote. So we don't know. We can speculate as to how he voted. If you look at his history, it's likely he voted to leave. I'm not saying we don't know. He's never come forward, as far as I know, to say which way he voted. But to drop, a bombshell like this on the same day as the current leader, Keir Starmer, has said that he will not allow Jeremy Corbyn to run as an MP or as a candidate for Islington North, I should say, is interesting. Now, once again back to the Brexit question. Why is Jeremy Corbyn a supporter of Brexit today, considering the damage that Brexit has done? Like, we don't hear a lot about Brexit from Jeremy Corbyn today, which is interesting as well. I've yet to hear any left-wing arguments in favour of Brexit, especially today. There were some in the past where it said, yeah, the European Union is pro-business and not pro-worker. That was one of the lines, I think, and against nationalisation of industry. That was one that was presented by Mick Lynch, which was false, because we have, for example, Scottish Water was nationalised when Scotland was a member of the European Union. Irish Rail is run by the state, and Ireland is currently a member of the European Union. So it's not a case of there's a left-wing Brexit and a right-wing Brexit. I think there's just a right-wing Brexit, a disaster Brexit, and a Brexit for racists and bigots. Well, I'm hoping that Jeremy Corbyn will come forward and clarify his position on Brexit, because Diane Abbott is sort of outing him as a Brexiteer, something that he's never said that he is. Very interesting. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think.
I have another article. This is from Labour List. Mistake to prevent Corbyn from standing for Labour, McDonnell says. This is a sort of a middle ground opinion. John McDonnell says, or has said, it's a mistake for Keir Starmer to prevent Jeremy Corbyn from standing as Labour candidate after the Labour leader confirmed that his predecessor would not be allowed to stand for Labour at the next election. In an interview with the BBC's World at One program earlier today, the former Shadow Chancellor and Corbyn ally said, I think it's a mistake for Keir to try and bar Jeremy Corbyn from standing. But it's not just about Jeremy, it's much more fundamental than that. The Labour backbenchers said, it's something more fundamental than whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or me or anyone else is allowed to stand. The issue for us is that we are created as a coalition of a whole range of different political views, a broad church as we describe it. And the norms of our party, the normative values of our parties, is to have the sort of mutual respect for those different views and hold together. That includes ensuring that we have democratic procedures where the rights of our party members is enable them to select the candidates of their choosing, and to undermine that flies in the face of everything that we stand for. Starmer gave a speech on Wednesday following the Equality Human Rights Commission, EHRC's announcement that it's concluded its monitoring of the Labour Party, which began following the equality regulator's investigation into allegations of anti-Semitism within the party. When asked following the speech whether Corbyn would stand for Labour at the next election, Starmer said, Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate. What I said about the party changing, I meant, and we're not going back. And that's why Jeremy Corbyn will not stand as a Labour candidate. In a statement released on Wednesday evening, Corbyn said, Keir Starmer's statement about my future's flagrant attack on the democratic rights of Islington North Labour Party members. It's up to them, not party leaders, to decide who their candidate should be. Any attempt to block my candidacy is a denial of due process and should be opposed by anybody who believes in the value of democracy. At a time when the government's overseeing the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, this is a divisive distraction from our overriding goal to defeat the Conservative Party at the next general election. The former party leader had the whip suspended in October 2020 following his response to the publication of the EHRC's report on allegations of anti-Semitism within Labour. Reacting to the report, which found Labour was responsible for unlawful acts, the MP for Islington North claimed that the scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents. Corbyn was reinstated as a Labour member in November 2020, but Starmer subsequently decided not to restore the Labour whip, meaning the former leader sits as an independent MP. McDonnell said today he thinks Starmer has completely misunderstood Jeremy's position, adding, "None of us should downplay the position with regard to anti-Semitism. As all of us have said, one anti-Semite in our party is too many. We've all got to tackle it, and I welcome that." He told listeners what Keir promised when he was standing for the leader of the party. He said he'd oppose and end the imposition of candidates by the National Executive Committee, and he said that the party members would be able to select their candidates for every election. What Keir said, particularly around this issue about democracy in this party, is that he'd uphold it, that party members would be able to select their candidates, and I'm urging him to stick to the promise. Otherwise, it'll open up a vulnerability. It'll open up a vulnerability that the Tories will use, the Labour MP argued. Guidance issued by Labour last year for selecting parliamentary candidates ahead of the next general election takes long listing powers away from local members in favour of putting the leadership in the driving seat. Under previous guidance, long lists were drawn up by selection committees made up of the local party secretary and the treasurer, and NEC representative, 2 affiliated organization reps, and others elected by the local party. A rule change seeking to return long listing powers to constituency, Labour Party, CLP, selection committees was defeated at last year's party conference, with delegates voting against the proposal by 56.95 to 43.05%. And this is from Squawkbox. Why Corbyn can't say he'll stand as an independent? Clamour is understandably growing for former Labour leader Corbyn to announce he'll stand as an independent in his Islington North seat, after his cowardly successor confirmed what everyone knew, that despite the sham EHRC's ban on political interference in disciplinary processes, Starmer's no intention of allowing Corbyn to stand as a Labour candidate. He never did, of course, despite initial agreements with Corbyn's team to do so. Starmer cares too much about right-wing pro-Israel opinion, and like most weak men, his reflex is to go over the top and trying to act strong. Corbyn has publicly responded to say that it's up to local members to decide and not Keir Starmer. Corbyn remains a Labour member after rightly being exonerated and readmitted following his suspension as a party member for saying something the HRC said he's a legally protected right to say. However, the Labour rights barely bothered to disguise its contempt for party democracy and rules, rigging a string of selections and ignoring conference resolutions, even overwhelming and unanimous ones that are supposedly binding. There's no allowance in the party rules for a party member not to sit as a Labour MP if elected, but that hasn't stopped Starmer's cowardly action so far in withdrawing the whip. And if Corbyn said now that he's standing as an independent candidate, that would give Starmer the chance to exploit the party rules to expel Corbyn from the party altogether and give the press the chance to make hay with it for the next 22 months, or however long is left until the next general election. While many will feel that since Starmer has effectively killed Labour as a force for anything except, at best, more of the same as the Tories, Corbyn formally on the outside of the party would be a good thing and a rallying point for a new political party. Corbyn is unlikely to feel he wants to hand Starmer that PR opportunity just yet. Of course, since there isn't realistically time for a legal challenge before the next general election and the courts routinely rubber stamp the regime's disregard for rules and democracy, even when the party's excuses it wanted to prevent someone challenging corruption, whenever an election's called, it's almost certain that Corbyn will have to stand as an independent Labour or similar if he wants to stand at all. Thousands from Islington and all over the country will flood the constituency to campaign for him the moment he announces, but Corbyn's likely to feel that to do so now would be premature and play into his enemy's hands. And here's part 3 of The Lobby by Al Jazeera.
The country's image. The reason we... as he secretly records events described by the media as anti-Semitic acts. For the first time, the other side of the story. Following decades of violence, a new challenge has emerged to Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, called BDS. BDS is here to stay. That's the global movement to boycott, divest, and impose sanctions on Israel and expose it as an apartheid state. The Israeli government has responded with a campaign to rebrand the country's image.
The reason we should fight BDS is because it's wrong. It's a moral outrage.
It's an operation run by the secretive Ministry of Strategic Affairs.
They recruit mainly former intelligence officers. Its main task is to counter BDS worldwide.
Using an undercover reporter, Al Jazeera's investigative unit exposes Israel's clandestine activities in London, a city that's become a major battleground.
BDS campaign in many ways germinated in Britain.
You'll meet the people working to challenge BDS at every level of British politics.
Okay, let's see what we work really closely together. A lot of it's behind the scenes.
One of Israel's main targets is the Labour Party. For the first time, its leader is a champion of Palestinian civil rights.
I'd be very happy to see Jeremy Corbyn no longer leader of the Labour Party, for sure.
It's a covert action that penetrates the heart of Britain's democracy.
Can you give us some messages that we suggest that you will take down?
It is outrageous interference in British politics. It shouldn't be permitted.
It's a battle of ideas seeking to change not only how Israel's portrayed, but even how it is debated.
It's anti-Semitic. No, it's not. It's betrayal.
The Labour Party is holding its annual conference in Liverpool. For the first time, the leader of a major British party is an outspoken critic of Israel. The Israeli embassy has sent its senior diplomats to canvass opinion. Our undercover reporter attends a private meeting of sympathetic labor activists. The ambassador, Mark Regev, tells them what to expect.
Some of the people here are more Palestinian than the Palestinians. And the fashion is, if you are on the left today, you are probably very hostile to Israel. If not partisan. I think when you...
Ambassador Regev suggests a message that should be delivered to other Labour Party members.
Why are people who consider themselves progressive in Britain supporting reactionaries like Hamas and Hezbollah? We've got to say, in the language, I think, of social democracy, these people are misogynistic, they are homophobic, right? They are racist, they are anti-Semitic, they are reactionary. I think that's what we need to see. It's an important message.
Jeremy Newmark, the chairman of the Jewish labor movement, reveals how the message worked with a close ally of Jeremy Corbyn.
Just to get Clive Lewis as one of Corbyn's key lieutenants onto an openly Zionist JLM platform took a lot of heavy lifting.
Clive Lewis, MP for Norwich South. Look, it's a real pleasure to have been invited here tonight. I've known Jeremy for over 20 years since my time working with Jewish...
Lewis's decision to condemn anti-Semitism at a JLM event was viewed as a tactical victory for the faction inside Labour that opposes Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn is the party's first openly pro-Palestinian leader. The faction that supports him is called Momentum.
We already have actually intelligence that from the Momentum political directors meeting last night, they passed a vote of censure on Clive Lewis just for coming to our meeting in Sweden.
At the time, Jackie Walker was Momentum's vice chair. She believes that reports of a crisis of anti-Semitism were a consequence of the same ruthless party infighting.
Some of us would say it was mostly a constructed crisis for political ends. I would say there is a crisis of the way that anti-Semitism is being manipulated and being used by certain parts of not just the Labour Party, but other parties and the media to discredit Jeremy and a number of his supporters. I mean, let's disagree politically. I'm anti-Zionist, they are pro-Zionist. Let's have that argument. Let's have that argument, not this that's going on at the moment, no.
Everything is wheels within wheels, you know? It's created a bit of division within Momentum.
The day before, I had a debate with Jeremy Newmark. At one point, he turned his back on the audience and whispered to me, "You're a court Jew." Now, anybody who is Jewish understands what that means. If you were being abused as a black person in the same way, you would be being called a house nigger.
Did you report it to anyone in the party?
I told my partner and I told some friends that had happened. It's very hard to use a system which is so discredited, which the compliance unit is.
Shai Massoud, whose job at the embassy includes liaising with pro-Israel groups in Britain, ends the meeting with a summary of his achievements.
The numbers, this year we did more than 50 events in the campuses of the universities of the embassy. There are more than 100 events that happen by the Israeli societies, by themselves, that they arrange in the campuses. And in addition to that, more than, I think, 8 receptions for young people in the embassy, including 3 receptions of 300 people that came, from the parliament. I would take a picture. Yeah.
Should I take a picture?
Yeah, you can take a picture.
Cheese.
Back at the LFI stall, Shai and the Israeli delegation continued debating whether to wear the pro-Israel t-shirts.
Shai has a dream. Shai has a dream. I'm going to make it come true today. He wants me to put on the t-shirt. But as Robin is my witness, I was going to put on that t-shirt today. And
I have a dream that an activist will not be ashamed of what he's representing.
I'm not ashamed of what I'm representing. It's a t-shirt.
It's a genuine question. If you say...
One party member was attending her first conference.
I heard there was a Labour Friends of Israel stall, and I thought this would be a really good opportunity to have a dialogue with a group I know who have a lot of influence, and it'd be very interesting to hear their ideas. So I found where their stall was.
Can I just ask you, you're very anti the settlements. What is Labour Friends of Israel doing about
We make our view clear, and we meet with people at all levels in Israeli politics and diplomatic circles, etc. And we make it absolutely clear we're not going to Israel enemies of Palestine. Hence our new campaign launching next month and that we're showcasing here. We believe in a two-state solution, coexistence and self-determination for both people. And that's really important.
How would that come about, do you think?
Well, our job is to support any possible means that can bring it about. So what are we supporting this coexistence project, which is what this is about?
I had no idea.
And notice it says, let's see, for Israel, for Palestine, for peace. And it doesn't say for Palestine, for Israel. It says for Israel, for Palestine. So that's albeit not even as intense of a bias as they actually have, that is a bias as well.
Quite honestly, who was behind the stall? There was a woman behind the stall. My first series of questions from memory was simply to say I was very interested to know how a two-state solution would come about. What would be the details? Not a slogan, but the details.
What do you like Israeli occupation?
Well, what we want is a two-state solution. And the reason we've not got it now is because there's a security for Israel.
Supporters of a two-state solution believe that a peace deal based on national boundaries that existed in 1967, before Israel's occupation, will one day lead to a viable Palestinian state. But the continued growth of Israeli settlements on occupied land has made an independent state all but impossible.
If you look at a map of the West Bank and East Jerusalem today, you are looking at a fragmented territory that Israel has colonized now for almost half a century. Practically speaking, a two-state solution is just not possible under these conditions.
I was actually seeking some reassurance that a two-state solution, if that's what they were promoting, was still possible.
This is a big picture situation, and we want a two-state solution.
I know you've said it enough times, but what's next? Because, the so-called party keeps saying...
I'm not going to defend or criticise.
But you seem as if you are defending Israel.
I would defend Israel. I defend Israel's right to exist. I defend it as a democracy and a social politics.
We don't suffer.
I think we have to be very, very careful not to let our feelings about this more.
So no feelings come into account. I'm not being anti-Zionist.
We have to be very careful. Don't we all want a two-state solution based on coexistence and peace?
I said time and again, I'm here to talk about the two-state solution which you are promoting. And this is what I'd like to learn about.
It's clear that the Israeli state, no matter which party is in power, has got absolute...
Israel, namely that the state and the country as a whole would go through a genuine process of democratization, as did apartheid South Africa. There is no third option.
Thank you, Jean. I enjoyed the conversation.
I'm asking you about settlements. They've totally atomised the homes.
That's what you're doing.
I'm asking, in terms of the West Bank is atomised, where will the state be? I mean, that's a genuine question. Where will the state be?
the activists who came to ask her tough questions about the settlements, actually. That was her main point. She didn't ask her about Judaism or the existence of Israel. She just wanted a straight answer. How does anyone who supports Israel justify the settlements?
We go over there, we witness, but nothing changes. I was quite interested in whatever funds they had and influence they had, how would this bring about a two-state solution? That was my very basic question.
Money, got lots of prestige in the world.
I don't know where you get that from, sorry. Labour friends Israel got a lot of money.
Well, I think so. I hear that it's a stepping stone to good jobs. A friend of mine's son's got a really good job at Oxford University on the basis.
I do, and I think we have to agree to differ.
No, I don't think we do have to.
Well, I'm agreeing to differ. I'm ending the conversation because I am not really.
Discussions that you have filmed, that the woman was not anti-Semitic. They know it. She didn't talk like an anti-Semitic person. She was a typical pro-Palestinian person who was worried about the violations of the Palestinian human and civil rights.
Ryan continued to reference banking, a traditional anti-Semitic trope, as she left the conference hall with our undercover reporter. But Jean had never mentioned it.
Anti-Semitic, you heard us say, join you lot and you get into Oxford or you get into work in the bank. Anti-Semitic.
At no point did I ever say that Labour Friends of Israel will get people jobs in banking in the city. I did say, which is absolutely true, that I know the son of a friend of mine who he believed himself that having some connection with Labour Friends of Israel didn't harm his career at all.
That evening, at a rally to combat anti-Semitism organized by the Jewish labor movement, Joan Ryan described.
So the banking language was interjected by the advocate of Israel there. It wasn't said by the advocate of Palestine.
Her day at the stall.
But we have also had 3 incidents of anti-Semitic harassment on our stand to the people who are staffing that stall today. And that, I think, tells you something about why we need to be having this against anti-Semitism rally.
By the following day, word had spread about Jean's exchange at the LFI stall. Several MPs came by and expressed concern, including Jeremy Corbyn's former challenger, Angela Eagle.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a couple of problems yesterday, but today's been better, where we did have one person towards the end of the day come and say Jensen was just being used to crush Jeremy, and that the allegations are sort of made up to a certain extent, which is obviously awful, but compared with stuff yesterday, it's sort of not as bad. Some of that sort of stuff is now becoming sort of less shocked about that than I was about what happened yesterday. I know, tell me about it. How are you anyway? You okay?
Oh, absolutely, loving it.
As well as Jean's case, other alleged incidents of anti-Semitism involve the attempt to replace the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Another prominent Corbyn opponent arrives at the stall and hugs Jennifer Gerber, the director of the LFI. Labour MP Shuka Umana asked for an update on the anti-Semitic incidents.
Oh, God, yeah.
One night it came up and basically said the coup was run by Jews, Jewish MPs and Jewish millionaires. And Andrew Eagle's husband is Jewish. You can make it up, can you? we reported it.
And so that was incident one. What were the other 2?
Joan, you were Joan dealt with the other incident.
Right.
The other incident yesterday.
I reported that incident, that woman. She took a video of me then.
What it was to then saying he got a big job in banking. Maybe she believes her own trope, if that's the word they use.
We had a woman say,
Not described my
Right. And so that was incident one. What were the other 2?
Joan, you were Joan dealt with the other incident.
Right.
The other incident yesterday.
I reported that incident, that woman. She took a video of me then. Joan Ryan, Labour Friends of Israel, looking away while I answer questions. She didn't show any of the bits where you know you're being anti-Semitic.
That's obviously
so I made formal complaints.
I am very shocked about the way she described my words to other people. I feel very anxious and that she should be misinterpreting me totally to other people. I find that very, very worrying.
I mean, I wrote it down, you know, all this which was one who went to Oxford, and the and he's got a big job in banking. And I said that, classic anti-Semitic.
Yes.
I have no idea how she got from A to Z. Going from my comment, which was what it was, to then saying he got a big job in banking. Maybe she believes her own trope, if that's the word they use.
I've never seen anti-Semitism. My Jewish friends have. They said, well, it is real. Is it real? Is it really real? It's just being used to crush Corbyn.
Yeah, undermine Corbyn.
And I said, as a bit, as a Jew, would you say that to any other, I've experienced homophobia, but I don't deny it. But anyway, it's only for you, I guess. Yeah. That's the way to out of it.
People are positive. We signed up lots of people.
Yeah, do you know what? Most people have been positive and nice. And kind of like solidarity. People are coming up like solidarity.
No. It's just a bit of stuff yesterday with explicit anti-Semitism.
Difficult moments, women who told us that anti-Semitism, was being concocted to crush Corbyn. That is what she said. And I think people, if we're not getting it out there.
Yeah.
But is that anti-Semitic, guys? I don't know,
I don't know where my line is anymore. I think it's different themes today.
I think if it makes you feel uncomfortable, and that's the point at which you call it out and report it. And that's why don't convince me to report the one yesterday, because I was made to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And although nothing anti-Semitic was said, I'm sure there were unders of it, and it was brought upon by that context.
I thought Labour Friends of Israel were talking about Palestine because they were promoting a two-state solution. Now I find they don't want to talk about Palestine. And if you do talk about Palestine, it would appear you're kind of sucked into having an accusation of anti-Semitism brought against you.
At the end of the day, if you feel offended by it and uncomfortable for it, there should be a safe space, and anything that breaks that should be reported. I think there is that line, obviously.
So they're really scratching the bottom of the barrel to make a list of 2.5 cases of anti-Semitism. 2 out of the 3, they themselves are not totally sure that they fall into their own strict definition of anti-Semitism.
Jean was unaware that her exchange with Joan Ryan had made national news and that a complaint of anti-Semitism was lodged.
I felt overwhelmed by being at the conference. I had no idea there would be so many things to go to, so many interesting workshops to go to, seminars at the same time as people speaking in the main hall. My husband hadn't been very well, so we actually left a day early.
Shortly after, Joan Ryan's assistant emailed Robin asking him to be...
Listen, if she had said the word Zionist, I would have said 100%. 100%.
Despite being unsure of what he had witnessed, Richardson had no qualms about the expulsion of a fellow Labour Party member.
How it works is, you make the complaint to the Labour Party within their own rules will decide. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect this woman might be potentially banned because she did say something that was anti-Semitic.
After Jean had left the conference, she was contacted by a Labour Party investigator. He would only say that it was about a serious incident.
I was thinking, had I a witness to something? And almost by return came an email that it was my conduct that was being investigated.
In part 4, the senior political officer at the Israeli embassy wants a private word with our undercover reporter.
I want to speak with you. Yesterday, actually, over a coffee, but let's do it on the way to the event.
Okay, whatever you like.
There seems to be a problem.
I can give you an idea, but you need to approach them independently. Do you understand?
And when does lobbying become espionage?
Can I give you some ideas that you will take down?
Well, you know, if you look hard enough, I'm sure that there is something that they're trying to hide.
It strikes me that this is the sort of job which the intelligence services should do, to have a good look at what's going on.
Okay, so we're having some buffering issues. I just want to get one more.
An open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whipped them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again. Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed. Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them?
Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Likud's Regev appointed to fill in while defense minister abroad, bypassing Smotrich. Despite religious Zionism party head holding ministerial post within the ministry, transportation minister to be substitute for Yoav Gallant while he attends conference in Germany. The coalitions decided...
Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.